Welcome, tennis fans, to Tennis Traverse, exploring the game. Normally, this podcast will be a dive into the tennis world, but we're doing things a little differently today because I just spent 4 weeks in one of the best journalism camps ever for my summer, and that is the reason why my quality of sound for my past 3 podcasts really haven't been the best, but I'm back with a lot of things to share with you guys. And even though this episode really isn't what Tennis Traverse is about, it's not about particularly tennis, but I just figured that I really want to share with you guys all that I've learned. And I totally understand if you just are not interested, since this is just about podcasting and sports journalism, but I figured my audience will be interested in learning about journalism in general. And yeah, so before we begin, please follow all of my social medias if you haven't already. That is Instagram and Twitter using @TennisTraverse. That is @TennisTraverse. If you are listening on YouTube, comment, like, and subscribe. If you are listening on other streaming platforms, please rate my show. And just want to preface that it is totally okay if you feel like skipping out on this episode, because this really isn't normally what I do. But since we have a period of time where there really isn't that many big tournaments going on, except that the Olympics literally start in 5 days, but I just really want to get this across since I really learned a lot of really valuable lessons from just being there. I'm not gonna give you guys the name of the program due to just privacy reasons, but I do want to say that I learned a lot, and it is one of the most selective journalism programs. So I want to start off with podcasting. So I think it's really important. The stuff I learned, the first one is it's really important to think about how your listener will take in the information. So that means going to the analytics and checking the demographics of your audience. Where are they from? The age, how old are they? And just the gender distribution. I think all of these are really important. And to do that, it's also crucial to interact with your audience. Just sometimes reach out to them on social media, or just leave a concluding remark of saying comment down below what you want to see more, what are some things I can improve on, or always to understand how the listener will take in the information. Or even another way, if a listener gives you a bad review, you can just reach out to them and be like, why do you think, you should totally be understanding that obviously they gave you a bad review, but you should ask them why did they give you a bad review and how can I do to improve. And the next point is use short, simple sentences and allow the information to reveal itself slowly. So this is something I think I need to work on as well. I'm not saying that I've perfected all of these, but these are just points that I think I need to work on as well. So to allow information to reveal itself slowly means not giving out everything at once, and preferably if you have a script, make sure everything is in short sentences. In my case, I don't really have a script. I just get on with looking at the match scores, so it's kind of different for me. But if you have a script, make sure all of the sentences are short and nothing is too long, and just everything makes sense. You have to listen back to it and make sure that the audience really get what you are saying. A lesson stuck out to me when I was listening to this lecture. Our instructor told us that when people are listening to your podcast, they're normally multitasking. They aren't just sitting down and listening to your podcast. They normally will be doing stuff. They will be, for example, driving to work. They could be cleaning their house, but they're doing all sorts of things while listening to your podcast. So you really shouldn't make it really hard on their brain to think about what you're saying, but instead to just deliver your message in a way that's, as I said before, short, simple, and concise. And the other point I want to point out is invert the inverted pyramid. Great radio stories have a narrative arc, beginning, middle, and end. Think of it more like storytelling. So this is when you're maybe writing a script for a story, podcast, and that's really different from what I do, because what I do is more of hard news, that is just reporting on what happened. But if your podcast really have a story and you're trying to storytell, it's really important that you have a beginning, middle, and end, and make sure that it's distributed properly. And even though it might not really be distinct or clear which part you can label as the beginning, the middle, or the end, but make sure that you, in your mind, you know what the beginning, the middle, and the end is. And the next is you're going to need transitions. This is something that I have to work on as well, because I feel like I definitely lack in this area. So by working on transition means not just saying that, okay, now let's move on to this topic, but you have to write out transition sentences, just like when you're reading a news story, to make sure everything sounds smooth and the listener will be able to follow. Because sometimes, as I said before, if your listener is just doing chores and you just suddenly go, now let's talk about another topic, it might be really hard for the listener's brain to just switch like that. Even though when you're reading the script of your podcast, it could be really easy because you're just reading the script and you know what the next part is going to be like. But remember, the listener, when they're listening to your podcast, they don't know what the next thing is going to be like. They don't know what the next sentence is. So it's really important to make sure that transitions are smooth and the listener can follow your logic and just your podcast like easily. And the next point is find your voice. Don't write something you wouldn't say out loud. This is really important. I was doing some script podcasting for the journalism camp, and they really made us read everything out loud. So for example, the word regardless is kind of hard to say in a podcast setting, and I didn't know that before. So when I wrote it, my instructor told me to just cross it out or just use however, or just use some word to replace it, because if it's not really a word that you can say easily, it's better to leave them out to avoid any just stumble on your words and confusion for the for the listeners. And the next point is talk it out when you write. It's the only way to know if it makes sense and sounds good. So that kind of goes back to the last point, which is you really have to talk and just read your script out loud. It doesn't, like, you shouldn't be reading your script out loud for the first time when you're recording it. You should be reading it out loud, for example, let's say 4 to 5 times, and just make sure that everything sounds smooth. And the way you structure your sentences, it's easy to understand and your voice just flows smoothly through all of them. And that is really hard to achieve because I think different people have different ways of saying things, but just make sure you don't have to care about how other people would think about it. Just make sure that you know and you think that it's the easiest way for yourself to say it, because if it feels really easy for you to say it, there's a greater chance for other people, especially your audience, to get what you're saying. And next, I want to talk about Nat Sound. So Nat Sound is really important. This is the background sound. So an example of this is my intro music, but I figured that that's the only Nat Sound I actually have in my whole podcast, and that simply isn't enough. So the goal of mine is to just add more Nat sounds, such as players hitting the ball, players grunting, or just umpires calling out the scores. So those are really great ways for the audience to stay engaged and get a feeling of what it actually is like. For example, on the tennis court at the match, with like players cheering after a point that's super exciting that I recited. The sound could be like audience cheering out loud and screaming, or like the player yelling "come on." So that sort of just brings the mood of the podcast, and it is really important to show, not tell. I think that's important in everything: writing, podcasting, sports journalism, just anything in general. It's really important to show instead of just telling them how excited the audience are. You can incorporate, as I said, yelling sounds, cheering sounds, to show how excited the audience are. The next point is, it's sort of for me, I really want feedback on how to make this podcast interesting. If this is your first time listening, it might not apply to you, but my podcast so far has just been me talking about tennis matches, and I figured that even though there's like news every week since the tennis store is so busy, I still really want to make it more interesting. So I was thinking about doing a segment of just, for example, my favorite tennis tips. So if you guys have any suggestions of what I should do for my segment, or just any suggestions in general of how do I make this more interesting, please feel free to just contact me through Instagram, through email. My email is just tennistraverse@gmail.com. That is tennistraverse@gmail.com. So please make sure, if you have any suggestions or just some comments or just want to talk to me, email me, and yeah, we'll see if I can take in your suggestions. After learning about audio journalism, another professor who worked in ESPN for 10 years decided to share with us a lot of sports journalism insights, and I figured that both of these points are important since my podcast is basically a combination of podcasting audio and sports journalism. So the first point is jobs in sports media increases because the amount of companies increased. So our professor basically guided us through a list of streaming services or news outlets for sports, and we saw that there are more and more news outlets for sports and just streaming services, and that just means that there are more, in a way, more subscriptions. But if you really want to work in the sports field, it means that you have more job opportunities, since there's obviously more companies, and more companies require more people to work for. And the next point is customers have to pay so much more because different media outlets are streaming different games. So this is, as I said, a point I mentioned before, because there are so many other streaming outlets, you have to constantly pay for a new one to make sure you watch all the matches. So that is a problem for consumers. And I also want to mention the next point, which is the importance of connection. So this really showed through, I think, through the lecture, because he keeps on talking about how he have these connections with these super famous people. For example, he have connections with Magic Johnson, with Steph Curry, and he also went to cover Wimbledon. And he said that all of these connections really help him to go in depth into the sports field. And I think that's something really important, and you always have to maintain your connection. Save every number in your phone. You don't know when you might need them, and just contact them like yearly, or just like, I don't know, like half a yearly, like 6 months. Be like, how have you been? Just wanted to check in, so that you just maintain connections. The next is, it's really important to consume media for experience. If you really want to be a writer, it's really important to read. If you want to be like a creative author, you should like read poetry, something like that. Like, you should always consume. If you want to be in mathematics, you should work on math problems, or like read works from other mathematics. So outlet that our professor recommended is Apple News Plus. So I will be linking the important information in my show notes down below, so you guys can look at it. But he said Apple News Plus is really great. It's actually quite expensive. It's $13 a month, but you get to look at all those really major news outlets, and there are also audio and video as well. So if you guys are interested, it's going to be in my show notes. And the other thing is, look at things at the past and that worked, and how you can echo it. I think this is really important, because when you look at things in the past, just like when you're consuming media in the past, you will learn from other people. You'll also learn their mistakes as well. And I think that's really valuable. And you'll make sure that you're not making the same mistakes. And you can just, in a way, not copy, but you can copy their style, not their style, but the format of their article, and figure out why it worked, instead of just, of course, I'm not telling you guys to plagiarize, but just why it worked, and think about how it can be applied to your own job or articles if you're a journalist. And the next point is, realize that consumers' desire of control, choice, convenience, and simplicity have not been altered by the recent changes in technology. So he keeps on giving this opinion on how technology, even though there has been a lot of talk with AI taking over journalism, AI taking over jobs, he believes that the consumer, which is the people consuming the news, the people who are subscribed to the media outlets, still prefer to get news from like actual people instead of AI. And I think, in my opinion, we have a long way to get to actually AI breaking the news. So I think just realize that you shouldn't let AI to be a huge factor in determining whether you should pursue journalism or not. And the other one is get noticed. Even the brightest idea needs to be original, more audacious, and more terrific. So make sure that you're constantly, if you want to put yourself out there, share your thoughts on Twitter or something, on any social media, and make sure that people know who you are. And even if you're just starting off with no platform whatsoever, I suggest you guys to create like an X, which is Twitter, create Instagram, or just create Threads. Even just create somewhere where you can share your opinions on, and if you want, you can even pitch to publications. Do a cold pitch. That's what we refer to when we send an email without them knowing who you are, and just be like, hey, I wrote this article, or I have an idea about an article. I was wondering if you guys want to publish it. And we never know what will happen. The other one is consumers don't reject advertising. They reject complacency. So this means that, I think it says it, it's literally what the sentence says, but I think it's really important that you know the difference between advertising something and being complacent about something. So yeah, and I want to end off with a quote by Peter King, and he ended this off his lecture as well. Content is still king, but financing the kingdom is more complicated. So I think that's the future of sports journalism. We really don't know what's going to happen. As I said before, there's a lot of more money involved since you have to subscribe to all of those subscriptions, and also with betting. But I think people are still there for the content. They still want to look at the games. They still want to watch the games. They still want to read those articles. They still want to look at ESPN, and I think that's never going to change, at least in my opinion, for now. So I'm really interested to see what's going to happen. And guys, that's all I have for today. It's really, I think, different from my other episodes, since it really isn't about tennis. It's just about sports journalism and podcasting, but I just really want to share what I learned with you guys. I really hope y'all enjoyed it, and if you guys haven't already, please subscribe to my social medias. That is Tennis Traverse. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Bye.